My mother said it right as dessert was being served. Her voice was light, almost casual, but every word fell onto the dinner table like a shard of broken glass. I wish you had never been born. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her, but then laughter erupted around the table. My father laughed first, then my older sister, then my younger one. The room filled with the clinking of spoons, the sound of wine glasses, and a chorus of laughter that wouldn't stop. I was the only one who stayed silent. I looked around and realized everyone thought it was just a harmless joke, something said for fun. But all I could feel was one truth: maybe I had never truly belonged here. Welcome to family ashes. If the person who gave you life publicly rejected you right there at the dinner table, would you stay quiet and endure it like I once did, or stand up and end it all? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to hear more true stories of people who were once broken, but found their way back to themselves. My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm 34 years old and the head nurse at a hospital in Dallas, Texas. My job demands long hours on my feet, overnight shifts, and sometimes emergency calls at 3 in the morning. I got divorced 3 years ago. No kids, no one waiting when I get home, just a small townhouse in the suburbs where I live alone. People often say a single woman my age is a failure, but I don't see it that way. I have a stable career, pay my own bills, and don't depend on anyone. I'm not a failure, I'm just someone who's never been recognized. My family has 3 daughters. My older sister, Samantha, is a well-known lawyer in downtown Dallas. My younger sister, Olivia, is a free-spirited artist, often praised for having a creative soul. And me, the middle child, I've always been the one forgotten in conversations, missing from family photos, invisible even at holiday gatherings. Since childhood, I've always been the one standing at the edge of the frame, and somehow, no one ever noticed. Samantha, my oldest sister, has always been my parents' pride and joy, and they've never tried to hide it. Ever since I was in elementary school, every dinner revolved around her name. Samantha was chosen as debate team captain. Samantha just won a writing contest. Samantha's going to a prestigious university. I remember sitting on the stairs at night, listening to my parents talk in the kitchen, their voices lowered but full of pride. That girl's going places, my father said. She's destined to succeed. I sat quietly, holding my homework, not daring to make a sound. Back then, I wasn't jealous, I just felt like the background of a picture painted too brightly. When Samantha became a lawyer, my father framed her diploma and hung it in the center of the living room. Right below it was our family photo, where I stood off to one side, smiling stiffly. Anyone who visited the house would hear my mother say proudly, "My eldest daughter works at one of the top law firms in Dallas." And when they asked about me, she'd reply casually, "The middle one's a nurse, somewhere." Sometimes I felt like the faint caption under a grand photograph, there, but irrelevant. My youngest sister, Olivia, was a completely different story. She was granted a kind of endless leniency that baffled me. Olivia changed careers like changing clothes, pottery one month, opening an art gallery the next, then finding creative inspiration a few months later. My mother never complained. She always said, creative people need freedom. I once asked quietly, "What about me, Mom? Don't I get freedom too?" She just smiled and said nothing. I understood then, in her eyes, I wasn't creative, so I didn't have the right to feel lost or tired. Olivia lived among colors and music, while I lived among medical charts and the beeping of monitors. Whenever I talked about work, about emergency surgeries, nights spent saving a life, they'd nod absently and say, "That's nice." "Oh, Olivia, did you finish that new painting yet?" Conversations always slid past me so quickly that I learned to smile and pretend not to care. As the middle child, I seemed born to be the bridge. I remember one time Samantha and Olivia fought over rent money. I was the one who sat between them, listening to both sides vent, and in the end, I was the one who paid the debt just to keep the peace. I still do that, covering for my mother's forgotten Christmas gifts, organizing my father's birthday when everyone else is too busy. I became the glue in a family that never wanted to stay together. I can't even remember the last time my mother hugged me. Maybe it was when I was a child, or maybe never. She was always busy praising Samantha, fixing Olivia's hair, while I only got practical reminders like, "Don't forget to call the insurance company, Claire." For a long time, I thought love was something you earned through effort. I tried to be the good daughter, polite, responsible, invisible when needed. But the harder I tried, the more I realized they only saw what I did, not who I was. In every old family photo, I'm always at the edge of the frame, sometimes half hidden behind someone's shoulder, sometimes turned slightly away. I used to laugh at that coincidence. But as I grew older, the laughter turned hollow. I existed in that house the way a chair exists in a room, useful, dependable, but unseen. I wasn't the one they loved, I was the one who kept everything from falling apart. And maybe that's why they never thought about my feelings until the night I placed my fork down and made the whole room go silent. I can't remember the last time my mother hugged me. Maybe it was when I was a child, or maybe it never happened. She was always too busy giving praise to Samantha, brushing Olivia's hair, and saving her practical instructions for me. "Don't forget to call the insurance company, Claire." I used to think love was something you earned through effort. I tried to be the good daughter, studious, polite, never causing trouble, always ready to help. But the harder I tried, the more I realized they only saw the things I did, not me. In old family photos, I'm always at the edge of the frame, sometimes half hidden behind someone's shoulder, sometimes turned slightly to the right. I used to laugh when I noticed that, but the older I got, the more that laughter stung. I existed in that house like a chair in the corner, useful when needed, but otherwise unnoticed. I wasn't the one who was loved, I was the one who kept everything from falling apart. And maybe that's why they never stopped to think about how I felt, until the night I set my fork down and made the entire room go silent. That Thanksgiving came on an unusually cold day in Dallas. Leaves scattered along the road, and the wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke from the houses around Plano. My mother called me early that week, her voice brighter than usual. "We're doing something bigger this year," she said, "to celebrate your sister's promotion to senior partner. It's an important event." She said the word important with that familiar tone, the same one she always used whenever the topic involved Samantha. I smiled and answered simply, "Yes, I'll come early to help, Mom." That was always my line, and as usual, she only replied with a brief okay. That morning, I finished my hospital shift earlier than usual, changed clothes, showered, and drove to Plano. The 30-minute drive from the hospital to my mother's house felt like passing through two different worlds, one loud, urgent, where people actually needed me, and the other, where I was just another piece of decoration at the dinner table. I used to think those two worlds were separate parts of me. But the older I got, the more I realized only one of them was real, and it wasn't inside that house. My parents' two-story home sat on a corner lot on Willow Bend, painted pale gray, with maple trees out front that had already shed most of their leaves. I parked the car and took a deep breath before ringing the bell. The door opened, releasing the warm smell of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce into the crisp air. My mother, as always, was wearing her apron, a wooden spoon in one hand, her hair pinned neatly at the back. "You're here," she said without looking up. It wasn't a greeting, not quite relief, just a statement of fact. The dining room was set with painstaking care. A burgundy tablecloth stretched across the long table, tall crystal glasses lined up perfectly, silverware polished to a mirror shine under the soft amber light. I could tell she'd been preparing all week. On the counter, the pumpkin pie was cooling, gravy steamed in a pot, and the air was thick with the buttery warmth of the kitchen. I slipped off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and stepped in to help, automatically, without needing to be asked. "Check the mashed potatoes for me, will you?" "I'll watch the oven," she said, eyes still fixed on the temperature gauge. I nodded. I tasted the sauce, added a pinch of salt, straightened the napkins. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't have to. She was used to me showing up early, taking over, doing what needed to be done. It was the rhythm of our family, one that had never been questioned. When my father came in, he carried that familiar scent of cologne I'd always associated with holidays. He patted my shoulder lightly and asked the first thing out of his mouth, "Is Samantha on her way?" I answered, "Probably." He smiled, satisfied, and went straight to the living room without another word. That was how our conversations always went, short, polite, but never real. I looked around the house, everything was exactly as it had been the year before, and the year before that. Samantha's law degree still hung front and center in the living room, Olivia's abstract paintings scattered across the walls, and the few photos that included me were tucked away in the corners, small, a little blurry, as if taken in passing. I used to think that was normal, but that night, as the candlelight flickered across the walls, I realized the distance between me and everything around me was longer than the drive from Dallas to Plano. A little while later, Olivia arrived, her hair loose, a long wool coat draped over her shoulders, the faint smell of oil paint still lingering on her hands. She kissed our mother on the cheek, hugged our father, then turned to me. "You look tired. Did the hospital make you work overtime again?" she asked. I smiled lightly. "Yeah, same as always." She laughed, a small, half-genuine, half-mocking laugh, the kind that suggested being a nurse was a boring choice. I didn't hold it against her. I just felt something inside me go cold. I helped set the table, rearranged the chairs, poured the wine. No one asked me to do it, but if I didn't, the table would stay messy until the turkey went cold. From the kitchen, I heard my mother's voice carrying through the house as she talked on the phone, her tone bright with excitement. "Samantha just called. She's almost here, and she's wearing the red dress Robert bought for her." I smiled faintly. Even when she didn't mean to, my mother always made it clear that conversations in this house only really began when Samantha arrived. I sat down at the edge of a chair, wiping my hands on a napkin, and looked through the large window where the last of the daylight was fading. Outside, the streetlights had begun to glow, each house in the neighborhood lit with warm golden light. Inside me, though, everything felt frozen. I knew exactly how the night would go, the same dinner, the same laughter, the same compliments for my sister, the same polite indifference for me. I'd played this role too many times, the listener, the quiet supporter, the one who smiled so the room wouldn't crack. But somewhere deep down, a new feeling was stirring, something like exhaustion, or maybe the first whisper of wanting to break free. At 6:30, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Samantha. Through the window, I saw her step out in a crimson dress, her posture confident, her smile bright. My parents rushed out to greet her, laughter and congratulations echoing from the driveway. I stayed where I was in the kitchen, my hands still damp from washing dishes, listening to their cheerful voices drift through the hall. I knew the dinner had officially begun at that moment, and, like every year, I would once again sit quietly beside them, smiling at the right times, nodding at the right moments, playing the part of the agreeable one among people who had never really seen me. What no one knew was that, in that very moment, something inside me shifted. I'd made a silent decision, this would be the last time I sat in that house like a shadow. Dinner began with the clinking of glasses. The light from the chandelier shimmered on the polished wooden table, red wine caught the glow of the candles, making everything look like a perfect magazine spread of a picture-perfect family. My mother raised her glass first, her voice glowing with pride, as if giving a speech at an award ceremony. "Tonight, we celebrate my eldest daughter, Samantha, for officially becoming a senior partner. I always knew you could do it, sweetheart. You've made this family so proud." My father laughed heartily, clapping Samantha on the shoulder. "That girl's been sharp since she was little. Always knew exactly what to say. Won her first debate at 12, no wonder no one can out-talk her now." He told that story at least 20 times, but each time he sounded just as thrilled as the last. I sat at the corner of the table, smiling faintly, watching the candlelight flicker across the wine glasses. The laughter and congratulations blended together into the same old melody I'd been hearing for years. My mind drifted back to the hospital that morning, to the sound of heart monitors beeping in alarm, the rush of footsteps, my name being called across the trauma room, and the moment an elderly man's heart started beating again after I'd pressed down on his chest for the third time. I'd saved him. A 70-year-old man whose pulse had stopped for more than 3 minutes. When his eyes opened, it felt like I'd pulled someone back from the edge of death. A part of me wanted to share that story, not for praise, but because I thought, maybe this time, they would actually care. When my father paused to pour more wine, I spoke, my voice calm but clear. "This morning, I saved a patient who went into cardiac arrest. Everyone thought he wouldn't make it, but after I performed CPR, his heart started again. I paused, glancing around the table, waiting for a reaction, just one look, or a simple, "That's amazing, Claire." But my mother only nodded, barely looking up. "That's your job, isn't it? That's what nurses do." Her simple response hit me like a string snapping inside. I heard Samantha chuckle lightly, then quickly change the subject to a high-profile case she was handling. "I'm representing a big real estate firm," she said proudly. "They're flying me to New York next month for negotiations. Robert and I might make a trip out of it." My mother leaned toward her, eyes sparkling. "Oh, that's wonderful. I always knew you'd go far. Dallas is too small for you now, isn't it?" The table erupted in laughter. Olivia joined in, pulling out her phone to show a photo of her latest painting, an abstract wash of colors, smoky and blurred, with the faint outline of a woman whose shoulders seemed to melt into the background. Everyone gasped with admiration. My father squinted, as if studying a masterpiece. "That's deep," he said. "You've got such a unique eye." My mother added, "So creative, just looking at it makes you feel something." Olivia laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear, half bashful, half proud. The conversation flowed easily around me, bright and animated, like a current that had learned how to move without ever touching me. I smiled when expected, nodded in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, drifting quietly toward the thought I had earlier that evening: this will be the last time. The conversation kept circling around the same two people, first about work, then vacations, then art exhibitions, then advice about what you should do next. I just sat there, one hand resting on the table, the wine in my glass growing cold. I wasn't angry, not even sad, just hollow, as if every sound around the table passed straight through me without leaving a mark. I smiled when expected, nodded at the right times, even added a few polite comments to keep the mood light. But deep inside, a quiet emptiness was spreading, heavy and patient. I knew it was only a matter of time before that emptiness would push me to move. Laughter filled the table again, never ending. It began as a small chuckle, then grew, catching like sparks in dry wood. My father laughed so hard he had to set down his wine glass to keep from spilling it. My mother leaned toward Samantha, patting her hand, her voice glowing with pride. "You've always made me proud. Even as a little girl, I knew you had the qualities of a leader." To her, it was just another compliment, but to me, it sounded like the steady tapping of a wooden mallet, rhythmic, unrelenting, echoing the hundreds of times I'd heard that same sentence before, every birthday, every dinner, every video call where she held up her phone to show Samantha's latest achievement. I sat at the head of the table, a spot I'd chosen only because it made it easier to stand up and clear the dishes later, not because anyone had invited me there. The red wine in my glass shimmered under the golden light, trembling slightly every time I breathed. The warm glow from the chandelier made everything look picture-perfect, but it felt false, like makeup hiding the cracks in an old wall. I looked around at my family, their faces animated and full of life, and all I wanted was to stand up and walk out of that room. My father started telling an old story, about Samantha, of course. His voice was bright with enthusiasm, as though nothing made him happier than reminiscing about his daughter's glory days. My mother nodded along, adding her exclamations at all the right moments. Olivia smiled, nodded, and occasionally asked for details, though I could tell she wasn't really listening. They were all performing their familiar roles, the storyteller, the admirer, the echo. And me, as always, the reluctant audience. I tried to smile, but my face felt stiff. The cold, empty feeling inside me spread like fog. I'd always told myself I was used to this, that the comparisons, the selective compliments, the overlooked glances were simply part of the family dynamic. I'd trained myself to swallow the small hurts until I couldn't even tell when they were happening anymore. But that night, something was different. Maybe it was the way my mother's laughter lasted too long, or the flicker of pity and mockery in Olivia's eyes when she looked at me, like I was the only one who didn't understand the joke everyone else was in on. I straightened my back, slowly turning the glass in my hand, watching the small ripples of red swirl inside. Their conversation moved from Samantha's firm to Olivia's upcoming exhibition in Austin. My father said, "You should ask your sister for advice. Samantha's great with contracts." My mother added, "Yes, your sister's a lawyer, she'll know how to protect your rights." Their voices faded into background noise. No one asked for my thoughts. No one turned toward me. No one noticed that I was sitting there, watching them carefully, memorizing every detail as if to make sure I would never forget it. I looked at my mother, her face lit with joy, at my father, his cheeks flushed from the wine, his eyes warm but distant, at my sisters, talking and laughing like two close friends instead of people who had once shared the same childhood as me. And inside, I felt something thin and fragile stretch tighter with every burst of laughter. I could feel it straining, that invisible string that held me together. My heartbeat stumbled. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion, an ache that came from living the same scene so many times it had lost all color. I realized I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep sitting there, smiling like everything was fine, holding together a piece that had never really existed. For years, I'd done it, silently, carefully, the way a nurse presses on a patient's chest to keep the heart beating, even when she knows it's already gone. And that night, for the first time, I felt that heart stop. I took a sip of wine, the burn tracing my throat, but it wasn't enough to warm me. I wanted to stand up, but my legs felt glued to the floor. I stayed where I was, smiling, listening, keeping the same old role. But inside, something had shifted. It was subtle, light as breath, fleeting as a passing breeze, but it was real. It was the first tremor of a storm I no longer wanted to hold back. I looked up at the half-burned candles, their flickering light dancing across faces that were all smiling. The scene was beautiful, but so cold it almost made me cry. I suddenly realized, I was sitting in the middle of my family, yet I had never felt lonelier. I didn't know why that night felt different, maybe because the years of endurance had gone on too long, or maybe because I had finally begun to understand that none of them would ever truly see me. I didn't know when the string inside me would snap, only that when it did, the sound would silence the whole room. When dessert arrived, the air grew warmer. The smell of melting chocolate mixed with cinnamon drifted through the room. My mother carried the cake out, her face glowing with satisfaction, as though she were presenting something precious. "Your grandmother's old recipe," she said proudly. "I only make it on special occasions." I nodded and smiled. For a moment, I thought the evening might end quietly, that I could just eat a piece of cake, wait for the dinner to finish, and slip away. But a few minutes later, I realized how naive that hope was. Silence, I would learn, could never save me at this table. After a few polite exchanges, my mother suddenly burst into laughter, sharp and high, the kind of laugh that always signaled something cruel was coming. "Do you all remember how we used to tease Claire when she was little?" she said, tapping her fork against her plate, her eyes gleaming with delight. "Oh, that time you told her she was adopted." She believed it, cried all afternoon, begged me to show her the birth certificate. The room erupted. My father laughed so hard he started coughing, managing to say between breaths, "That girl was so gullible, she'd believe anything anyone told her." Samantha smacked her hand on the table, threw her head back, her laughter booming over the soft music in the background. Olivia doubled over, shoulders shaking. "You cried so hard," she said between laughs. "You kept asking if Mom really picked you up from the hospital. You were adorable." I smiled, a thin, trembling smile. I remembered that day vividly. I was 8. Samantha and Olivia had locked me in the living room and told me I wasn't Mom's real daughter, that I'd been brought home from an orphanage. And I believed them, completely. I packed my clothes, my toys, into a little backpack and planned to run away. When my mother found out, she just laughed. "Oh, they were joking, sweetheart. You're too sensitive." Then she laughed with them, and their laughter filled the house, not the laughter of love, but the kind that made me feel like the punchline of my own existence. But my mother wasn't finished. She looked at me again, eyes bright with amusement, her voice calm but cold. "Remember that night you woke up screaming at the mirror? The girls had drawn on your face, smeared lipstick all over your cheeks, and told you, 'The ghost in the mirror is coming for you.' The whole neighborhood heard you. The neighbors thought the house was on fire." She laughed so hard that tears streamed down her face. My father shook his head, waving a hand as if watching an old comedy he still enjoyed. "Kids will be kids," he said, chuckling. Claire was just a little too easy to scare. Olivia covered her mouth, still laughing. Oh, I remember her face. She cried for hours. Mom had to calm her down. Samantha chimed in, if there were an award for believing anything people told you, Claire would have won first place. The laughter roared again, filling the room, bouncing off the walls, clashing against itself. I sat perfectly still, staring at the fork in my hand catching the light. My mind began to fog. That laughter wasn't just in this room, it was the echo of years, from the old dining room, from the backyard, from every time I had been teased until I cried and no one stepped in to protect me. I remembered the cool touch of my mother's hand wiping my tears, the way she laughed afterward, saying, "You're too sensitive, Claire." That feeling, the sting of shame under the mask of comfort, it was still there, buried but alive, waiting for tonight to wake it up again. And now, it had. I looked around the table. My mother was still laughing, her eyes glistening with tears. My father leaned back in his chair, lips curved into a faint smile. Samantha was radiant, and Olivia had practically folded over with laughter. They laughed freely, joyfully, as if I wasn't even there. They talked about me, not to me. I was their subject, their entertainment, and that realization made the air in the room turn heavy as lead. I could feel every beat of my heart, slow, deep, deliberate. The wine glass in my hand trembled. I didn't know why I was still sitting there, still holding that faint smile on my lips. Maybe it was because I'd spent my whole life learning how to stay composed. I heard my father say, "Come on, Claire, you have to admit it was funny back then, right? Everyone has memorable childhood stories." I turned to him and said softly, almost tonelessly, "Funny for who, Dad?" But no one answered. My mother hurried to cover the silence, cutting another slice of cake. "Come on, eat before it gets cold. You like the corner pieces, don't you, Claire?" I looked at the piece of cake in front of me, thick white frosting, sweet enough to make me nauseous just by looking at it. Everyone was still laughing. I heard Olivia recall another funny memory, my father chiming in, my mother gasping, "Oh my, that's right," over and over again. All of it blended into a harsh, chaotic noise. Each burst of laughter was like a small cut, shallow but constant. I didn't feel pain right away, only a slow burn spreading under my skin. I leaned back slightly, watching the candlelight flicker across the table. For a moment, I thought I would do what I always did, stand up, leave quietly, disappear before anyone noticed. But something in my chest had changed. A heat was rising from deep inside me, climbing from my stomach to my throat, choking me. I couldn't hear anything except the heavy, deliberate thump of my heartbeat. They kept talking, kept laughing, while I was slipping further and further away from the scene, as if I were watching it from outside my own body. I looked at my mother. She was still wiping her tears, trying not to laugh, but failing. And in that instant, I knew I'd reached my limit. I no longer felt guilty. I no longer felt pity. I wasn't trying to understand them anymore. All the old emotions, sadness, anger, shame, dissolved into a single, terrifying calm, like the quiet before a storm. I knew that if I spoke, if I let even one sentence escape my mouth, no one at that table would ever forget it. But I also knew, it was time to say it. The energy in the room began to shift as the laughter finally started to fade. Maybe they sensed it too, that they'd pushed too far, but none of them had the sense to stop. Samantha kept talking about her firm, my father was already a little drunk, and my mother was riding that strange high she always got when she had an audience. Olivia leaned back in her chair, smirking, and suddenly turned to me. "You always make everything so heavy, Claire," she drawled, her tone playful but sharp. "You're so serious all the time, so gloomy. I don't think anyone's ever lasted 10 minutes in a conversation with you without wanting to leave." The others laughed again, this time awkwardly, harshly, the kind of laughter that collides with itself and dies midair. I didn't answer. I just stared into my wine glass, watching the dark red liquid glint like congealed blood under the candlelight. Everything inside me slowed down. There was that familiar feeling again, the one that came every time I realized I was about to become the joke, the one no one would defend. I'd lived long enough to recognize the signs. It was that awful stillness before a storm, when even the air seems to thicken until you can hardly breathe. And then my mother spoke. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her gaze was fixed on the chocolate cake in the center of the table, as if she were talking about the most ordinary thing in the world. Her voice was steady, but carried clearly across the room. I wish you had never been born. Maybe then this family would finally be at peace. The words fell softly, no anger, no theatrics, but they wiped out every other sound in the room. The clinking of utensils stopped. The faint jazz music from the speaker went silent in my mind. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained, slow and deliberate, marking the growing void between us. I lifted my head and looked straight at her. I wasn't sure she even realized what she just said, but her face stayed composed, eyes bright, posture straight, lips pressed together. Maybe, to her, it was nothing more than an offhand remark. But to me, it was the final blow, precise, cold, and clean, cutting through the last thread that had ever tied me to them. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't react the way they might have expected. I set my fork down, slowly, gently, the sound of metal against porcelain rang sharp and dry, cutting through the air with a chill. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. My father froze midair, his wine glass suspended, his hand trembling slightly. Samantha's smile faltered, her mouth still half open, eyes wide with confusion. Olivia stopped laughing, her face tightening with the realization that she'd gone too far. I looked at each of them, one by one, my gaze moving deliberately, as if I were engraving their faces into my memory for the last time. Finally, I stopped on my mother. My voice was low but steady, each word falling like the edge of a blade. If that's what you truly want, I said, then this time I'll make it come true for you. No one moved. My words weren't loud, but they carried across the room so clearly that even the faint crackle of the candles could be heard. My mother stiffened, her face blanching for an instant before she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, come on, Claire. What are you saying? I was only joking. Her tone wavered, thin and uncertain, and everyone at the table knew, no one believed it was a joke anymore. My father tried to say something but stopped halfway through a word. Samantha stared down at her hands, fingers tightly entwined. Olivia dropped her gaze, her smile completely gone. The entire room froze in that moment, a silence so thick it seemed to hum. I sat still, breathing evenly. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel guilty. I just felt light. So light that I thought a single gust of wind might lift me away. I realized that for years, I had sat through dinners like this, swallowed words like this, convinced that I had to stay, to endure, to keep the peace. But in that instant, when my mother said those words, I knew there was nothing left to hold on to. I pushed my chair back and stood. The legs scraped against the floor, the sharp sound slicing through the heavy silence. I smoothed my shirt, folded my napkin, and placed it neatly on the table. My movements were slow, deliberate, visible. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe. I looked at them one last time, not to blame, not to remember, but to make sure I felt nothing at all. My mother opened her mouth but said nothing. Maybe she too sensed that something irreversible had just broken. My father sat frozen, hands on the table, head bowed slightly. Samantha blinked rapidly, perhaps regret, perhaps disbelief, but whatever it was, it came too late. I turned and walked out of the dining room. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, steady, matching the rhythmic ticking of the clock behind me. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I might hesitate, and I couldn't afford weakness, not tonight. Behind me, the room was still lit, but that light now looked pale and foreign. When my hand touched the doorknob, a rush of cold air swept in, carrying the scent of the season's first rain. I drew a long breath and stepped outside. The door closed softly behind me with a quiet click, final and precise, a sound that felt almost merciful. A chapter of my life had ended cleanly, ruthlessly. Inside, I knew they were still sitting there, swallowed by silence. I didn't need to see it to be sure. As for me, I knew, with an almost frightening clarity, that this would be the last time I ever sat at that table, in that house, with those people. And strangely, in the chill of the Texas night, I felt warmth spreading in my chest, warmth that didn't come from love, but from freedom. That night, I drove home in silence. The highway was empty, the wind slamming against the windows, carrying a long, thin whistle that sounded almost human, like someone trying to hold back tears. Dallas lay under a thick veil of darkness, streetlights shrinking in the rearview mirror like fading memories. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't play any music. The only sounds were the tires humming against the asphalt and the steady thud of my heart. My mother's words no longer echoed in my head. What lingered was the silence after, the same suffocating quiet that I knew would follow them too, the same silence that had followed me all my life. When I finally reached home, the clock read a little past 11. My townhouse sat quietly between two others, their porch lights casting a faint yellow glow onto my walls. I unlocked the door, flipped the switch, and the room filled with light, but it wasn't warm. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning, the stack of medical books on the table, my coat draped over the chair, the coffee cup with a ring of dark residue at the bottom. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, then sank into the couch. The silence was so deep I could hear the ticking of my own wristwatch. I didn't cry. I thought I would, that after enduring an entire evening like that, the tears would finally come, but they didn't. The well had run dry long ago. All that was left was an emptiness, a bone-deep exhaustion, like my entire body had just walked out of a storm and was left only with its wreckage. I sat there for a long time, watching the reflection of the lamp in the window pane, thinking about the dinner that had just ended, about the look on my mother's face when I stood up. And I knew, this time, I wouldn't go back. Not to make a point, not to make them regret it, but simply because there was no place left to return to. I got up, walked to my desk, and opened my laptop. The cold light from the screen washed over my face. I typed in nursing director positions in Seattle, Washington. Dozens of listings appeared. I read each one carefully, filled out applications, uploaded my resume. Each click of the mouse sounded sharp and final in the quiet room, every click like the snip of scissors, cutting away the cords that still tied me to Dallas, to that house, that family, those memories I'd carried too long. I deleted contacts from my phone, starting with the ones who never called unless they needed something. Then my mother's number. My father's. My sister's. I didn't want to leave any doors open, because I knew that if one remained ajar, they would walk through it and pull me back as if nothing had happened. I changed my phone number, reset my email, canceled appointments, unlinked every social account. Each small task made me feel a little lighter, as if I were peeling away the invisible ropes that had been wrapped around my neck for 30 years. By almost 2 in the morning, I was done. I stood up and walked slowly around the room. The gray walls, the white curtains, the old armchair, the bookshelf, the desk lamp, they were all so familiar, yet now they looked different. They no longer felt like the things I returned to after a long shift, they were witnesses to the first true freedom of my life. I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd once believed. I was standing in that rare silence that separates two lives, the one I had survived, and the one I was about to begin. I turned off the main light, leaving only the small lamp beside the sofa. Its glow was soft, gentle, not bright, but enough to reflect my face in the glass. I looked calm, strangely calm. No more tension between my brows, no more lips pressed tight from fear of saying something wrong. I touched my reflection and whispered, "From now on, no one gets to hurt you. Not even them." Then I turned away and closed the laptop. Outside, a light rain had started, tapping against the roof in a steady rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. I sat down, inhaled deeply, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I knew I would leave Dallas, leave the past, and shed the role of the peacemaker daughter they had forced me to play for half my life. That night, in the quiet of my small, empty home, I felt free. And in the hush of the rain, I understood something. Sometimes freedom doesn't come from forgiveness or revenge, it comes from the moment you finally choose to walk away, without looking back. 3 weeks after that night, my phone began to ring nonstop. At first, just a few scattered calls, my mother's number, then my eldest sister's, then the youngest. I let the ringtone play, watched the screen light up and buzz softly on the table, then fade. Once. Twice. Dozens of times. The calls came more often at night, right after I finished my shifts, during the hours when exhaustion and quiet could make the heart most vulnerable. But I didn't answer. I already knew what waited on the other end: the late apologies, the justifications, the attempts to patch something that had been broken too long. I'd heard them all before, and believed them every time. But faith, like a stretched rubber band, once it snaps, it can never go back to what it was. On the 10th day, I switched my ringtone to silent. On the 15th, I started turning my phone off during breaks. Once or twice, in a weak moment, I hovered over a voicemail, tempted to listen. But I stopped myself. I was afraid of my mother's voice, the same voice that had once sung me to sleep, scolded me, softened me. I knew that if I heard even a single "Claire, I'm sorry," every wall I'd built would collapse. So I didn't listen. I let the calls come and go like wind brushing against a door that was already locked. Then one afternoon, just after I'd come home from the hospital, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the polite tap of a mail carrier or a neighbor, it was urgent, familiar, filled with emotion. I froze behind the wooden door, key still in my hand, my heartbeat so loud I could hear it in my ears. Then came a voice, my mother's. Hoarse, trembling, weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Claire. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it," I was angry. "Please, come home. I can't eat, I can't sleep. I miss you, sweetheart." I closed my eyes. The words hit me like the notes of an old song I'd tried for years to forget, familiar, aching. I could picture her face perfectly, wet eyes, clenched hands, the silver streaks in her hair. Part of me wanted to open the door, to run to her, to tell her that I still loved her even after everything had shattered. But the other part, the one that had grown calloused from too much pain, held me in place. I didn't open the door. I stood there and listened to her cry outside, her sobs fading little by little until there was nothing but silence. Then came the sound of footsteps retreating, slow, heavy, defeated. I stood there a few more minutes, my hand still resting on the knob, before I turned away. That night, I sat down at my desk and opened the email from the Seattle hospital I'd applied to weeks earlier. There it was, a reply. A short message, polite and professional, with a clear date and time for an interview. I read every line carefully, my pulse quickening. It wasn't fear I felt, it was something lighter, freer, almost like happiness. 6 weeks later, I left Dallas. I cleaned my little townhouse until it gleamed, locked the door, and dropped the keys in the landlord's mailbox. I left no forwarding address, sent no goodbye emails. I packed a few suitcases, some medical files, and a handful of books I loved. The morning flight was early, the sky was gray and cold, but I felt strangely at peace. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the city shrinking below me, the web of yellow lights stretching like the net I'd been caught in for too long. I knew then that I wasn't just leaving a city, I was leaving an old version of myself behind. Seattle welcomed me with its chill and dampness, its streets carpeted with golden leaves, and the comforting smell of coffee drifting through the air. I rented a small apartment near Lake Union, where every morning I could hear the sound of birds mixed with the gentle splash of water against the docks. On my first day at the new hospital, I buttoned up my white coat, pinned on my name tag, Claire Mitchell, nurse supervisor, and caught sight of my reflection in the glass door. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger, but for the first time in years, she felt real. No one in Dallas knew where I'd gone. I'd left no trace for them to find. And that didn't sadden me. On the contrary, for the first time in my life, I could breathe. I wasn't waiting for anyone to call, no longer haunted by the need to explain myself, no longer afraid of the confrontation that might come. Everything, the phone, the memories, the past, had gone silent all at once. I remember one early morning in Seattle, when fog covered the lake in a pale white veil. I made a cup of coffee, opened the window, and filled my lungs with the cold air. No one called my name, no one asked me questions, no one waited for me. And in that silence, I heard something I hadn't heard in years, my own voice, faint but clear, "You're free now, Claire." I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time, I truly believed it. Winter in Seattle came slowly, but it was colder than I expected. In the mornings, when I opened the window, mist slipped into the apartment like thin white smoke, light yet stubborn. I grew used to it, the damp streets, the clouds of breath, the sound of the streetcar rolling past Lake Union. My days settled into a quiet rhythm, long shifts at the hospital, emergency surgeries, elderly patients smiling when I called them by name, and in the evenings, I came home, cooked a bowl of soup, turned on the warm yellow lamp, and played the radio. Life had become so peaceful that sometimes I forgot I'd once lived differently, surrounded by laughter, comparisons, and the sweet cruelty of my family's voices. Then, one late February afternoon, my phone rang with a name I hadn't seen in years, Evelyn, a former colleague from Dallas. I hesitated for a few seconds, a small ache blooming in my chest. No one from Dallas had contacted me since I left, and I hadn't given my number to anyone except a few people from work. I answered, and Evelyn's voice came through, quiet but clear, as if she were afraid I might hang up. "Claire, are you okay?" she asked. Then, without waiting for my response, she continued softly, "I saw your mom yesterday at the store. She looks different. She's thinner. Unsteady. I heard your parents have been fighting. Your dad moved out, I think." I stayed quiet, my fingers tightening slightly around the coffee mug I was holding. Evelyn continued, her voice slow and careful, as though each word had to be weighed before it left her lips. "And your sisters, Samantha and Olivia, they aren't speaking to each other anymore. There's been some kind of dispute over the accounts and the house in Plano. I heard from one of the neighbors that Thanksgiving was canceled this year. Your mother said she didn't have the strength to host it. The house is empty now." I sat still, listening to the rain tapping softly against the window pane. The droplets slid down the glass, leaving long, blurry trails behind. In my mind, I pictured the house in Plano, the one that used to glow with light during every holiday dinner, now dim and hollow, echoing only with the sound of the wind through the backyard. I didn't know what to feel. Not sadness, not satisfaction, just a heavy, muted ache, like looking at an old photograph gone yellow with age. Everyone in it was still smiling, but you could tell the picture had died a long time ago. "Are you going to call them?" Evelyn asked quietly, almost afraid of my answer. I said softly, "No. I think they need silence, the same way I did." I thanked her, exchanged a few polite words, then hung up. I sat there, staring at the blank phone screen. Images began to flicker through my mind, my father sitting in the garage, smoking, my mother standing in the kitchen in her flour-stained apron, Samantha and Olivia arguing over the last slice of cake. All of it played like an old film reel, silent, distant. And I realized, they had begun to taste the very thing I'd lived with all my life, the silence between people who no longer know how to reach each other. When I left, they had believed I was just being too emotional. My mother even told the neighbors, "She's just sensitive. She'll come home soon." But now, things were different. For the first time, I think she truly understood what silence meant, not the silence of stubbornness, but the silence of loss. I imagined her sitting in the living room, where Samantha's framed law degree still hung, and Olivia's abstract painting still covered the wall. Maybe she kept the lights on all night, trying to fill the emptiness. My father was probably still in the garage, listening to the sound of passing cars without saying a word. As for my sisters, I didn't know where they were, but I was certain of one thing, each of them was learning the lesson I had mastered long ago, that when the person who keeps the peace finally leaves, silence becomes the loudest sound in the world. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was lighting up, the reflections dancing on the surface of Lake Union like 1,000 broken mirrors. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, looking at my reflection, loose hair, calm eyes. I didn't look like a winner, nor a loser. I just looked like someone who had survived. I exhaled slowly. "They're finally tasting the silence I lived with my whole life," I said quietly, not with bitterness, but with recognition. "Everything in life has its price. They chose laughter to drown out my pain, and now they're left in the echo of laughter that's gone. I chose silence to save myself, and now that silence has become my peace." That night, I sat alone at the table, poured another cup of coffee, and watched the rain fall steadily outside. I thought to myself, maybe retribution never needs curses or plans. Sometimes, all it takes is for one person to walk away, and the world of those left behind collapses on its own. The irony is, once they lost me, they finally started to hear each other, but it was too late. I took a sip of my coffee. The bitterness spread across my tongue, but it no longer hurt. I smiled, not out of joy, but with understanding. Silence, I realized, has a voice of its own. And for the first time in many years, that voice belonged to me. Seattle had become my true home, a city that breathed differently than Dallas, where every morning was wrapped in fog, where the air smelled of coffee, and no one asked too much about your past. Here, I wasn't the middle daughter of the Mitchell family. I wasn't the peacemaker, or the forgotten one at the edge of the photo. I was simply myself, Claire, 36 years old, head nurse of an inpatient unit, greeted by name and with genuine warmth. Colleagues smiled when they saw me, patients held my hand and said thank you. For the first time, I felt valued, not for what I did, but for who I was. Seattle taught me how to begin again. The rain here falls so often that people stop trying to escape it. They just open their umbrellas and walk slowly, letting the drops soak into their hair and clothes. Maybe I was learning to do the same. After everything, I stopped trying to avoid pain, loneliness, or memory. I let them come, touch me, and pass through. Maybe that's what growing up truly means, not erasing the past, but facing it without fear. I met Ethan on a night like that, a rainy one. The cafe near the hospital was packed, and the only open seat was a small table by the window. He asked politely if he could sit there. His voice was gentle, his eyes calm, with a quiet sadness behind them. We talked about work, about the weather, then about small, ordinary things, the kind of music he liked, the dishes I liked to cook. There was no forced curiosity, no probing questions, just two strangers sharing a table while rain whispered outside. Maybe that's why I felt so at ease. Ethan was an aerospace engineer, simple, grounded, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He never asked about my family. He only said, "When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen." I didn't tell him right away, and he never pushed. Instead, he showed up, steady, kind, patient, taking me to the hills overlooking Elliott Bay, teaching me how to sail, sitting beside me on nights when old memories still slipped into my dreams. With him, I didn't have to be strong to be loved. I didn't have to be silent to keep the peace. I just had to be myself. And that was enough. We got married in a small ceremony by the lake. No elaborate dress, no grand reception, just a few close friends, co-workers, and genuine laughter. I looked around and saw no one from my old family, but strangely, I didn't feel sad. I realized happiness doesn't need witnesses. It only needs understanding. A year later, I had a daughter. When the doctor asked what I wanted to name her, I thought of 100 names, but only one stayed, Grace. I chose it not just because it was beautiful, but because of what it meant, grace, kindness, forgiveness. I wanted her to grow up in gentleness, in love, in the safety of being heard, not in silence and comparison like I once did. I wanted that when she asked, "Mom, are you proud of me?" I would never say, "I knew you'd make me proud," but instead, "You don't have to do anything to make me proud, sweetheart, just be you." When Grace turned 2, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky and uneven, as though written after sleepless nights. It began with "My dear daughter," followed by pages of apology, confession, and longing. She said the house in Plano had been sold, that my father had moved in with his cousin, that Samantha and Olivia no longer spoke. She wrote that she'd been wrong, that she had never truly understood me, and that she wished she could hear me call her mom one more time. I read the letter to the end, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my desk drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt calm. I no longer hated them, but I didn't want to go back either. Forgiveness doesn't always have to mean reconciliation. That night, I sat beside Grace's crib, watching her sleep. The warm yellow light fell softly across her tiny face, peaceful and perfect. I brushed her hair back gently and whispered, "I named you Grace so you'll always remember, you were born from love, not silence. You'll never have to fight for your place in this world the way I did." I stayed there for a long time, listening to the rain outside the window, and it came to me, my life had come full circle. Not perfectly, but completely, where pain, silence, and forgiveness met to form peace. If anyone were to ask me whether I regret leaving, I'd say no. Because sometimes, leaving isn't about hate. It's about survival. And only when you survive can you truly begin again, with a new life, a new breath, and a love that's real. Have you ever found yourself in the same place I was, trying so hard to keep the peace, only to disappear inside your own family? If it were you, would you stay and endure it, or walk away to save yourself? Life isn't always fair, but it always gives us a choice. You can forgive without returning. You can love without getting hurt. And sometimes, leaving doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're finally strong enough to choose peace over noise. If my story touched you, leave your thoughts below. Have you ever had to walk away from someone just to live as your true self? And don't forget to subscribe to Family Ashes, where real stories are told, and where we learn to rise again from the ashes.